Can
It's
you edit
recording.
those? All right. Welcome to our presentation. We are presenting on our Gap Inc. analysis, and this is Aspen, and I'm Ryan, and the other two that contributed were Aaron Clausen and Zhang Zhao. Our first part is on internal analysis and the value chain. The inbound logistics. Gap Inc. Relies on over 800 vendors worldwide, and mostly in China and Vietnam. And then it goes into their operations, their physical locations. They are mostly based in the United States. They have 2,500 in the United States and the rest in other parts of the country, with a total of 3,715. Then their outbound logistics focus on transporting and strategically located. And Gap holds a large amount of inventory in their distribution centers, and they just created 2 big distribution centers in Arizona and Tennessee. Marketing and sales. Every year, Gap spends about $687 million on advertising, especially at the end of the year, where that's their biggest point of sales during the holiday season. And for follow-up service, they're able to communicate well with their customers, and they have a strong return policy. And this leads us into the 5 force analysis.
So for our external analysis, we decided to go with the 5 forces. On our diagram, you can see what we labeled each force as a threat to the company. We decided that the threat of competitive rivalry was high because of how many stores that are so similar to Gap Inc. and Old Navy and the other brands that Gap holds. Some of these examples would be JCPenney or Ross. For the threat of substitutes, we decided it was low to moderate. One of the substitutes of Gap buying clothes there would be to make your clothes at home, and that's not really something that a lot of people in today's day and age do. The other substitutes would be thrift stores or Plato's Closet, which is kind of the in-between of thrift stores and JCPenney, brand name clothes. The bargaining power of buyers was low because if a buyer walked into Gap or Old Navy or Athleta and tried to negotiate a price with the cashier would look at them like they were crazy. And if the person decided to walk out without buying anything, Gap Inc. is not going to struggle or have to lower their prices because you weren't interested. For the bargaining power of suppliers, we also said low because there are so many options for clothing manufacturers, and one person or one company or manufacturer is not going to change how the opportunities are for obtaining clothing. The threat of new entrants was moderate. It's pretty easy to make a company and come out with clothing lines, but it's not as usual for those companies to get as big as Gap Inc., where they are competitive in their rivalry. And that was all of them.
So for their business and corporate level strategies, big Gap Inc. Gap Inc. has a diverse strategy, and their focus is to target a broad amount of people. So they want to focus like on the individual, or they care about groups of people, so they market to them individually. And then their business strategy, each brand under Gap follows a different type of business strategy. Old Navy follows a more cost leadership strategy, and then Athleta, or women's clothing, follows a focus differential strategy. Banana Republic sits in the middle with their with all their products. They sell a little bit of both, so you can have high and low extremes. And then I'll go into this.
So we identified 2 of the major defects in Gap Inc.'s strategy. The first one was that they are struggling in Europe as most consumers don't relate to their style anymore. An analyst at MarketWatch said that as one of America's most iconic retailers, Gap could formerly rely on the luster of its American name to establish international prestige. Given that European consumers have no patriotical alliance to shop with the brand, their inability to remain relevant has resulted in a significant decline and has lost the market share it once carved out in Europe. Gap Inc. actually put out a statement regarding this issue, not specifically to Europe, but just that consumers are not relating to their brand anymore. And they said that they are committed to researching clothing and youth trends to increase the popularity of their product and design. The second defect was pretty similar to that. It was just that in general, they lack unique clothing design and customers all over are losing interest. And one way that our group decided that they could have a solution to this is that if they update their clothing to be more comfortable and casual, it can hit the generation that's now working from home, as well as if they update more design options, it would increase their popularity everywhere. And that leads to the timeline.
So this is effectiveness of Gap mergers and acquisitions. So the first acquisition Gap had was the purchase of Banana Republic Travel and Safari Clothing Company. This was a company focused on selling outdoorsy clothes and people that wanted to be in Africa. And they purchased them in 1983. And then in 1994, Gap Inc. came out with the Gap Warehouse. And in its first year in 1993, the Gap Warehouse did very well. And they decided to change that into Old Navy, one of their biggest brands. And then in 2008, Gap acquired Athleta, the popular women's apparel clothing. And this was Gap's biggest acquisition, and it cost $150 million. Then after Athleta was Intermix, a very bougie boutique store that was founded in 1993. And this was Gap's second biggest purchase of $130 million. And then Gap Inc. Created another company, and this one was Hill City in 2018. And this is a men's apparel clothing line. And then after that, in 2019, they bought Janie and Jack, and they acquired them for about $35 million. And Janie and Jack is a children's clothing store, but Gap is now turning away from Janie and Jack, Hill City, and Intermix, and they're going to sell two of them off and discontinue Hill City. And that leads into corporate governance.
So to sum up corporate governance, I found a statement from the board of directors on their website, and I really liked it. So it said, for us, good corporate governance means going beyond compliance. It means taking a leadership role in instituting and maintaining practices that represent strong business ethics and ensuring we communicate consistently with our shareholders, customers, and neighbors around the world. In order to institute this, they do formal annual performance evaluations, and they're conducted to make sure that all board members and committees are productive and to determine where the board may need improvements and new skill sets. Part of this is their code of business conduct. And each board member is expected to act with integrity and to adhere to the principles applicable to the directors in the company's ethics code. This is a statement directly from the corporate governance guidelines on Gap Inc., by the way. They also said that any waiver of the requirements of the code of business conduct for any individual director would require approval by the audit and finance committee. Any such waiver would have to be publicly disclosed. And then last, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the process of how they elect their CEO. As you can see in the diagram, these shareholders actually have a choice in who they elect for the board of directors. And it's the board of directors' job to elect the CEO, which is how Sonia Singhal got her position where she is today. And that wraps up our presentation for Group 2.